Modern life brings incredible advances in science, technology, and comfort. We're richer, safer, and more well-fed than our ancestors could have dreamed. Yet despite all this progress, mental health issues are rising at an alarming rate. Historical records suggest a noticeable uptick in what we now call schizophrenia during the 19th century. One of the defining traits of modern times is how much we focus on the individual self, turning inward instead of seeking meaning in something external. This shift exploded in Western cultures, especially with the rise of individualism, subjectivity, and relativism. People began to prioritize self-awareness and inner control, giving rise to the psychological man, someone obsessed with mastering his inner world. But mental illness doesn't develop in a vacuum. It has to be understood in the broader context of today's society, marked by bureaucracy, secularization, technology, and cold rationality. Life in modern times is filled with competing demands and confusing expectations. Even as we're encouraged to be unique, we're also expected to mold ourselves to society's norms. This inner conflict between being yourself and fitting in can split a person down the middle. Psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, in The Myth of Mental Illness, took issue with how psychiatry pathologizes human suffering. He argued that behaviors labeled as schizophrenic are often just responses to the challenges of living. If you talk to God, you're praying. But if God talks to you, you're schizophrenic, he wrote. The point isn't that mental illness doesn't exist, but that many so-called disorders are really desperate attempts to cope with life. Labeling them as diseases might make things easier to categorize, but it masks the deeper struggles people face. As modern humans become more self-aware, they also take on more responsibility. Sartre put it bluntly, "We're condemned to be free." That means we can't hide behind others when it comes to choosing how we live. Our lives are ours to shape, and that burden can be overwhelming. Kierkegaard warned of two traps: getting stuck in endless overthinking, or losing yourself in the crowd and becoming just another anonymous face. The second type, he said, leads to a kind of spiritual deadness, what we might now call depression. You're still physically alive, but it feels like you're not really living. Sooner or later, we all confront the question, why am I doing this? Camus illustrated this perfectly with the image of repetitive daily life. Wake up, commute, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Everything feels fine. Until one day, it doesn't. That moment of doubt, that sudden feeling of weariness, is the beginning of existential questioning. Camus' absurd man sees the futility of it all, like Sisyphus rolling a boulder uphill, only for it to roll back down. When life's routine no longer answers your why, you're left with two choices: find a new path, or risk falling into despair. Sometimes, that crisis becomes so intense, it pushes people towards suicidal thoughts. One major turning point in this story was the Enlightenment. It shook the foundations of Western society by calling religious values into question. Suddenly, the stable meanings that had grounded life for centuries began to fade, and the search for a new kind of meaning began. This shift has brought deep cultural, psychological, and social consequences. Many people today find themselves in a kind of existential fog, unsure of what life means or how to handle the struggles that come with it. In the past, we had clear answers. Religion offered comfort and purpose, reassuring us that we were part of something divine. But with the decline of belief in God, famously declared by Nietzsche as the death of God, we're now beginning to feel the true impact of that loss. Nietzsche warned that most people wouldn't even realize what had happened, that this shift was still echoing, still unfolding. And yet, it changes everything. leaving us with the unsettling question: does life have any meaning at all? Many feel lost, unsure of their place in the world, or what to do with their lives. One person who deeply engaged with this question was Viktor Frankl. He lived through unimaginable suffering and came out with a powerful insight. The modern epidemic of mental distress, depression, aggression, addiction, often stems from a crisis of meaning. He called this state the existential vacuum, a kind of inner emptiness. Frankl argued that unless we recognize this root issue, we can't really understand what's happening to people. His approach to therapy wasn't just to treat symptoms, but to help people reconnect with their sense of purpose. For Frankl, asking what gives life meaning isn't some luxury. It's a core human drive. Without meaning, everything else starts to feel hollow. He believed that the sense of pointlessness fuels the very conditions we now call mental illness. And in his eyes, nothing helps a person survive tough times more than knowing their life has meaning. In his words, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer by being responsible for his own life. This longing for meaning isn't new. Jungian psychologist Joseph Anderson, in Man and His Symbols, described the hero's journey as a universal myth. The hero has to go through darkness, face danger, find inner strength, and come out transformed. Often, early in the journey, the hero gets help, mentors or guardians who support him until he can stand on his own. It's a lot like growing up. At first, we rely on our parents, but eventually, we must face the world on our own. True growth begins when we stop depending on others and start taking responsibility for ourselves. Carl Jung, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, wrestled with the question, what's really going on in the minds of the mentally ill? He believed therapy only truly begins when we dig into a person's most personal story, the hidden part of their life that's causing them to fall apart. Symptoms aren't the real issue. The real work is understanding the full person. Jung worked with many people diagnosed with schizophrenia, people most doctors had given up on. Schizophrenia, he found, was a strange paradox. It felt like the person was dissolving into the world, and at the same time, the world was collapsing into them. It's a state where you might believe you're both God and worthless, all at once. One patient he treated, an 18-year-old girl, had been deeply traumatized after being abused at 15. Her supposed schizophrenia turned out to be deep, unresolved depression. What Jung discovered was that behind many so-called psychoses were just people trying to survive overwhelming pain, people whose stories had never been told. She withdrew completely from others and shut herself off from the world. Eventually, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital and remained in a catatonic state for some time. Over the course of several weeks, Jung slowly encouraged her to speak. It took patience and persistence, but eventually, she opened up and told him she'd been living on the moon. She explained that she didn't like this world. She found it cold and meaningless, whereas life on the moon felt beautiful and full of purpose. Jung wrote that the abuse she suffered in her youth had left her feeling ashamed in the eyes of the world, but in her imagination, she felt uplifted and powerful. The result was complete disconnection from reality, a psychological break. She escaped into the cosmos, into a distant fantasy where she encountered a winged demon. By telling Jung her story, it was as if she betrayed that demon and chose to reconnect with a real, human relationship. That moment gave Jung a new understanding. Behind many mental illnesses are rich, often painful, inner experiences. In his book, Tribe, Sebastian Junger explores how humans are wired to live in tight-knit communities. These groups gave people identity, purpose, and a sense of belonging. But modern society has eroded this tribal bond. Interestingly, during early conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes, many captured settlers were given the chance to return to their communities, yet some chose to stay with the tribes instead. In contrast, there are no records of tribe members voluntarily leaving for modern society. These tribal systems were based on interdependence. Everyone played a necessary role, and survival was a shared responsibility. Most members only needed to work around 12 hours a week, far less than the 40+ hours expected in today's world. Tribes hunted, gathered, and shared what they had, creating a deep sense of connection. While modern tech promises more leisure, most people today feel trapped in a loop of endless work and financial stress, often at the cost of their personal freedom. Sure, modern life offers a kind of independence primitive people didn't have, but that freedom often comes with feelings of isolation and despair. Our biology hasn't caught up with the rapid changes of farming, industrialization, and now digitization. Despite living in highly developed societies, we're still genetically designed to be hunter-gatherers. That's why someone can be in a room full of people and still feel completely alone. We're meant to belong, to feel useful, and to be valued for what we bring to a group. Without that connection, many feel lost and meaningless. The sociologist Emile Durkheim observed that during times of war, suicide and mental illness rates dropped. Similarly, after natural disasters, people often show incredible acts of selflessness, putting the needs of their community ahead of their own. In times of crisis, we revert to something older, something more human. These moments reveal how deeply we crave community and purpose. In contrast, modern comfort often breeds self-centeredness, weakening the social ties that once grounded us. Jung saw this clearly. He believed the stability of the world rests on the human psyche. And right now, that psyche is fragile. We've become so focused on logic and reason that we've lost touch with the primal instincts that once guided us. This disconnect creates a dangerous imbalance. He warned that modern people don't realize how vulnerable they are to the unconscious forces within them. We think we've moved beyond superstition and myth, but in doing so, we've thrown away the symbolic and spiritual frameworks that once gave life meaning. The result? A world spinning in confusion, with people increasingly dissociated from themselves and each other. As Jung put it, unthinkable events have shaken the world. And since then, we've been living in a kind of global schizophrenia. Our rational minds may have freed us from old fears, but they've also left us without a compass. On the surface, it might look like we've scrubbed our world clean of superstition and irrational beliefs. But if you take an honest look at the human mind, you'll still find ancient instincts alive and well, quietly shaping how we think and act, just like they did hundreds of years ago. People today often feel disconnected from the universe because we've lost a meaningful bond with nature. When a traditional culture's spiritual roots are disrupted by modern life, it can collapse. The people lose their sense of meaning, their communities fall apart, and their moral compass fades. Ernest Becker pointed out that anthropologists have long observed how entire tribes, once they lose faith in the value of their way of life, can stop reproducing, or even give up on life altogether. Even with food all around, it turns out humans need more than just calories to survive. Unlike our ancestors, we've become strangers to the natural world. We've broken the deep, almost mystical connection we used to have with animals, trees, and the rhythms of nature. Sure, we've made massive progress in technology and science, but our inner worlds are still fragile, scattered, and often confused. One famous story that reflects this inner fracture is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the novel, the psychological split becomes a literal transformation. But in real life, this division is something internal. Jung explained that we can become taken over by moods, forget things we should remember, and act in ways that don't make sense, even to ourselves. We talk about self-control like it's easy, but it's actually a rare and difficult strength to develop. There's a huge difference between choosing to temporarily push down part of your inner self and being overpowered by it without warning. The first is a conscious act, a mark of maturity. The second is more like a primitive collapse or even a sign of mental distress. To heal this inner divide, Jung encouraged us to dive into our unconscious minds. He suggested using tools like dream journaling and deep self-reflection to uncover what lies beneath the surface. Within us are forces and patterns that we don't control, what he called autonomous personalities. This is where we find the keys to understanding ourselves. These forces aren't random. They reflect ancient mental blueprints called archetypes, universal patterns that live within all of us. Despite our individual differences, we share a collective unconscious that reshapes itself to fit each of our lives. The problem is, we spend so much time asking what we think that we forget to ask, what does our unconscious mind think of us? And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Confronting the shadow, whether personal or collective, is not a one-time event. It's a process that unfolds over years, sometimes even a lifetime. It doesn't happen in the therapist's office over a single session or during a weekend retreat filled with meditation and journaling. Those things help, absolutely, but real shadow work shows up in the grind of everyday life, in our reactions, our judgments, our arguments, our silences. It's in the moment we choose to pause before lashing out. It's in the discomfort of admitting we were wrong, or the courage to say, this hurts, and I need to deal with it. The truth is, the shadow thrives in avoidance. It gains strength every time we deny our envy, our anger, our prejudice, our desire to control or manipulate. It hides behind the mask of perfectionism, behind sarcasm, self-deprecation, virtue signaling. And collectively, it hides behind nationalism, economic systems, religious dogma, and even noble-sounding ideals when they're used to justify harm. That's why awareness alone isn't enough. Awareness without responsibility is like seeing smoke and doing nothing to stop the fire. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That means looking at ourselves without flinching, not excusing, not glamorizing, but recognizing that within us all is the capacity to harm, just as there is the capacity to heal. That's the paradox. You are both the wound and the medicine. You are both the one who suffers and the one who inflicts suffering. Owning that duality is what frees us from being controlled by it. When we don't do this work, when we project our unresolved inner conflicts outward, it creates division, violence, and scapegoating. We see it in how people dehumanize those who disagree with them, how political discourse turns into warfare, how history becomes a battleground instead of a place for learning. The collective shadow erupts when masses of people project their fear and shame onto a group they label as other. And this doesn't just happen in the past, it happens now. Every time we silence a minority voice, every time we ignore a cry for help, every time we protect comfort over truth, we feed that shadow. But there's hope in the fact that the opposite is also true. Every moment of honesty softens the shadow. Every time you take responsibility for your behavior, apologize with sincerity, or listen with empathy, you're doing the work. Not just for yourself, but for your family, your community, even generations to come. Because trauma gets passed down, yes, but so does healing. This is why healing isn't selfish. It's revolutionary. Choosing to face what's broken inside you makes it harder for that brokenness to break someone else. When you meet your rage instead of unleashing it, when you name your shame instead of hiding it, when you hold your grief instead of numbing it, you make space. Space for growth, space for love, space for wholeness. And the world needs that more than ever. Of course, shadow work isn't glamorous. You probably won't get a round of applause for doing it. It won't look pretty on a resume or make you the life of the party. In fact, it might make you quieter, gentler, more discerning about your words, more aware of your limits. It might break your heart open a dozen times. But through that breaking, something new is born. Integrity, depth, real connection. A sense that you're finally living from a place that's not reactive, but real. And when more people begin to live from that place, things shift. The world doesn't change overnight, but it becomes more human, a little less divided, a little more tender, and maybe, just maybe, a bit more capable of holding the weight of our shared past, without collapsing under it or repeating it blindly. So yes, the war is inside us. But so is the ceasefire. So is the healing. So is the possibility of a new story. We just have to be brave enough to tell the truth, and tender enough to hold it. If this reflection gave you something to think about, I hope you'll support the channel, whether that's through Patreon, a like, a comment, or by sharing it with someone else. Thanks so much for watching.